Hello everyone. This is Brad Zasoff from INETCO, and I'm excited to welcome you to the INETCO webinar, What's the ROI? Building Your Case for ATM Transaction Monitoring and Analytics, presented by INETCO's VP of Product Marketing, Mark Forbes. A few quick notes before we get started. We are recording today's webinar and we'll be sending you a link, so there's no need to madly scribble down notes during the presentation. Today's webinar will take about 30 minutes, which will leave us about 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end. And the chat facility is live, so should you have questions during or at the end of the presentation, please be sure to send those through. And with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Mark.
Great, thanks very much, Brad. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time out of your day to attend today. And we'll be sure we deliver as much value as possible in the presentation. Let me slide on to the agenda, and we'll have a quick look at what we're going to talk about for the next half hour or so. We're going to start off by talking about what's different about today's ATM fleet and kind of some of the observations I've made over the last few years, put that in the context of the evolution of the ATM as a channel, and also talk about the changing role of the ATM in an omni-channel environment and how that's starting to change the way that we want to look at ATMs and want to conceive of them as part of our service portfolio. Then a big part of that is actually looking at some new metrics for how we measure the performance of the ATM channel and the performance of the ATMs themselves. We need to start looking at this a little bit differently, and we'll make the case for why and how. And then last, we'll talk about how to actually build a business case to do some different and deeper monitoring of the ATM channel by looking at transactions. So once we've kind of made the case for why it's important to look at transactions, we'll talk about how you can build a business case and really get a strong return on investment in transaction monitoring technology. And then we'll finish up with an open Q&A and capture anything along the way. So with that, let's just start with the broad 20,000-foot context and talk about the evolution of self-service. Really, when ATMs first came out, the focus here was cash withdrawals, balance inquiries, envelope deposits, and we were really focused on the availability of the ATM. As long as the ATM was available, typically the customer was able to transact, and you could kind of correlate those two events pretty carefully. It was rare that an ATM that was available, for some reason, couldn't execute transactions. That started to get a little bit murkier as we moved into sort of the mid-period here, where banks began to expand the services they offered at ATMs, so account transfers and bill payments, and trying to take high-cost routine teller transactions and shift them out to the ATM. And this got more complicated, but still most of these transactions ended up coming back to a transaction switch. And again, as long as the ATM was available, typically most of these services worked because they were kind of a one-to-one connection to the bank. As we look today at the sort of multi-vendor hardware and software environment of ATMs and the number of value-added services that are being added at ATMs as well, and interaction now between the ATM and other channels, all of a sudden there's a real difference in how the ATM behaves. And actually this next slide kind of gets into that, where the ATM of yesterday executed a pretty small number of transactions, or not a very diverse range of transactions is maybe a better way to put it. And those transactions followed a single path from the ATM through a network you owned into an ATM server or a switch, and then into your host system. And here, monitoring your device health and your cash position really was what you needed to do to make sure the whole thing was running properly. Today, banks typically execute at least 8 different transaction types, but often up to 100 different transaction types across their ATM fleets. But the big change is those transactions follow multiple paths. They don't just go into the switch anymore. They're often connected directly to third parties, or they go into other application servers in your environment. Examples here are envelopeless deposits and appointment booking services are both things that don't necessarily touch the transaction switch, but that go into another application server. A lot of the mobile top-ups or utility bill payments that you may be supporting at the ATM go out to third-party services rather than directly into your environment. And so there's a big change between the ATM of yesterday and the ATM of today. And that kind of gets to the question of ATM availability. And this has always been our golden metric for the ATM channel. We look at what percentage of time the ATM is available. Many banks have very complicated formulas for working this out. The success of people's jobs, sometimes their bonuses, depend on hitting certain availability numbers. But as the ATM environment has become more diverse, ATM availability is perhaps not the only metric we want to look at in terms of understanding how the channel is performing. And I'll give you a couple of examples where ATM availability doesn't necessarily measure what you're seeing. For instance, is an ATM available if the customer can deposit cash and withdraw cash, but they can't deposit checks? So in other words, if one particular transaction is not available, but the others are available, is the ATM still available? Well, under traditional ATM availability metrics, it would be, and yet the customer is not going to be satisfied when they try to deposit a check. Is the ATM available if you can execute a financial transaction, but the appointment booking service doesn't work? Well, again, in the mind of the customer who's trying to book an appointment, the ATM's not working, and that the service that they want is not available. If it can execute financial transactions, but marketing screens aren't displaying. Okay, well, this is an interesting one because it's actually, the consumer probably doesn't mind, but if you're trying to hit certain targets for using the ATM as a channel to acquire customers or upsell them, you're going to be really disappointed if those marketing screens aren't being presented and the rate of take-up on an offer declines. If most of the transactions are working on the ATM, but certain card types aren't working, is the ATM available? Well, traditional metrics would say yes, it is. But again, a whole batch of customers here that aren't going to be able to transact successfully. And then the final one is, if everything is working, all the transactions are working, but they're slow, your ATM is going to be available, but the customer experience is going to be suboptimal on it. So these are all cases where using ATM availability as a metric doesn't necessarily capture the complexity of what your consumers are doing and the types of services that you're offering them at the ATM. And so this really means, to me, this is an opportunity for us to think about how we go beyond ATM availability and start to really measure the consumer's experience. And one of the best ways to look at this is to try to look at, and if you go back to all the examples I gave, what we're really trying to figure out is how many times was a customer unsuccessful in using an ATM? Or perhaps even at a more granular level, how many times were they unsuccessful trying to execute a particular transaction or use a particular service at the ATM? Many of our customers do more than one thing in an ATM session. So obviously this can happen if the machine is unavailable, and in which case our availability metric captures it. But if the desired transaction is unavailable, you won't see that pop up in an availability metric, but you would if you're watching the consumer's experience. Same sort of thing if they abandon the transaction. Perhaps it's too slow, or it times out, or they get lost in the screen flows because it's too complex. There's a growing number of reasons a customer may abandon the transaction. They may try to book an appointment in the branch and find out that there's no appointments during the slot that they're interested in, so they just cancel out of the transaction and leave. Understanding all of these events requires really careful monitoring of the transactions themselves. And so really looking not just at the availability of the machine, but looking at how the transactions are being used and how well they're performing. And this is what gets us into the space of transaction monitoring and analytics. So here, what we want to be able to do is almost come up with a technical means of standing over the shoulder of every customer as they use an ATM. In other words, we want to capture every consumer's interaction, every transaction. We want to be able to take that data, and because we're not watching over the customer's shoulder, we want to actually be able to put metadata into that transaction so it feels like that. We can understand who the customer is and what they're trying to do and what card number they're using, where that ATM is geographically, and then make that information readily accessible. And what transaction monitoring and analytics done right can do is give you that information in real time for any transaction and any service on the ATM, regardless of whether it comes into your transaction switch, goes off to a third party, or goes into a different part of your application environment. And this is actually a big change. Many of you may have looked at or investigated or even deployed transaction monitoring technologies that run on your switch. Which is great for that core set of 6 or 8 transactions that do still execute on the switch. But a growing number of the services you're offering don't touch the transaction switch, and therefore you don't have that visibility into most of the areas where you're actually investing heavily in the ATM suite right now. So one of the key things as you're thinking about transaction monitoring and analytics is, how do I get this for every transaction in real time? Then there's 3 ways you can use this once you've got it in place. One is for proactive alerting, so knowing about problems and about what's happening in the ATM environment before your customers do. And we'll talk about some of the advantages of this in a moment. The second is being able to investigate issues very quickly so that you can resolve issues, find lost transactions, without having to pull together a lot of data or without having to wait for problems to reoccur before you can really understand them. And then finally, being able to mine this data so you can actually get better awareness not only of the performance from a technical perspective of the ATM environment, but also how it's performing from a business standpoint, how you could improve it and where you could optimize it. So transaction monitoring and analytics has sort of 3 core use cases: that proactive alerting, the reactive investigation, and being able to actually get better information about what's happening in the channel. So what we're going to do for this next section is actually look at business cases built around each of those use cases. So look at 3 distinct business cases. To do that, we've got a bit of a model environment here. There is a white paper that we've written that is a companion to this presentation that gets into a lot more detail on the metrics here. So I won't take you through the full model, but I will just kind of explain some of the high points of it so you understand where we're coming from. As you can see, we're looking at an environment with about 2,000 ATMs, a certain number of transactions per month, and an availability of 98.5%. So you can plug your own numbers in here. Your mileage will vary. But in this particular environment, that means there's about 180,000 failed consumer interactions per month. Now, when you look at this from a financial perspective, again, we put some numbers in here: surcharge revenue of $2. Many banks will actually credit themselves for transactions that are on us, because otherwise, the assumption is otherwise they'd have to pay another bank to take that transaction for them. So they give themselves a credit for that. And that's part of how they put together the profitability equation for an ATM. And then we look at on us versus off us. At the end of the day, and there's a lot more detail in the white paper in this model, there's about $158,000 in revenue that's lost or at risk because of those failed consumer interactions. So what we're going to look at in some of these examples is how to better handle this situation. So the first one is this notion of proactive problem discovery and the notion of getting alerts in real time and being able to follow transactions in real time. 2 out of 5 performance incidents in the typical IT environment are spotted first by customers and then reported to the help desk. Now, when you think about that, that means that customer interactions are failing before you even know it, which is a big problem. The other thing is there may be a number of those interactions failing before anyone thinks to report it. You may have the first 5 customers that notice it just sort of brush it off and go on with their day. So this problem could be happening for quite a long time before you become aware of it. That gap between the occurrence of the problem and the discovery could be minutes, it could be hours. In some cases, it could be days in more remote locations. And during that time, you're losing revenue and your ATM is becoming less profitable, and there's really no good reason why it is, except you just don't know. You're just not aware of the problem. So there's revenue that's leaking unnecessarily here. So with INETCO Insight, our customers have been able to achieve up to a 26% improvement in their failed transactions in year 1. So they're both able to understand why transactions are failing and address systemic issues, but they're also able to spot those problems when they first occur and shrink the time between the occurrence of the problem and when they discover it, typically down to seconds. So when you start to model this out for the environment that I put up there, we can get to a point where pretty easily you've got 50,000 fewer failed customer interactions in a month. That gives you almost a 0.5% improvement in availability, and it brings almost $500,000 in annual revenue to the bottom line. So all of a sudden your ATM environment becomes significantly more profitable just because you're able to spot your issues before your customers do and reduce the impact that they have on your environment. In the second case, in the average enterprise, 46 hours a month is spent in a war room trying to diagnose and understand application or infrastructure performance problems. Now, And again, these numbers are all pulled out of some industry analyst research that was done about a year ago. But if you think about what's actually happening here, you're taking expensive resources, you're pulling them off projects, and you're asking them to diagnose problems. So two things are happening. One, they're working flat out to diagnose a problem, but two, whatever project they were working on is now suffering, and it may not hit its timescales. But worse than that, you've probably, if you've been in one of these rooms, you've got the network person, the application person, someone from ATM operations, maybe you've got a third party on a conference bridge. You have multiple experts that are working in parallel to try to solve this problem because no one has a single view of it. They're all compiling their own information. So this is really inefficient. There's a lot of redundancy in the process. And so your operating efficiency suffers, but also the project timelines, the things that the real work that those people are supposed to be doing is suffering in the background as well. So with Insight, our customers are able to achieve a 65 to 75% improvement in their mean time to repair, which is a great number, but there's actually a story behind that number, which is they're typically able to isolate the root cause of a problem with one person instead of using 2 or 3 or more. So they don't have to have multiple parallel teams because one person can get all the information they need about a transaction in one place. So there's a huge efficiency improvement there. In fact, you can see that, that the time spent isolating problems goes from 375 person days to 50 person days. In other words, rather than spending a year every year isolating problems, you're spending about, well, less than 2 months. So significant change here. And finally, this really brings, again, savings to the bottom line in terms of $150,000 in labor cost savings. So at this point for our model environment, we're up to about $650,000 in annual cost savings just by monitoring your transactions and being able to use the information more intelligently. But the next piece, though, gets into how you can actually use this information not just for technical troubleshooting and keeping your environment running better, but for actually supporting your key business initiatives and better understanding how to make your ATM channel work for your customers. So 57% of businesses say that their data volumes are growing faster than their ability to get insights. And most ATM channel managers I talk to experience the same thing, where there's lots of data out there about the ATM fleet. It may be fragmented, some of it's incomplete in different places, but it is really hard to harness that data to get information. You've got hundreds or thousands of consumer interactions happening in parallel. There's a lot of detail in each of those interactions that you're probably interested in. The data goes different places. Sometimes third parties own part of it. Sometimes you get part of it. It's hard to line it all up. And so the actual information you need to make decisions often arrives days, weeks, or even months later than you need it. So it's really hard to act upon it in an effective way. What I'm going to do here is take you through 3 customer examples where we have banks who have used INETCO Insight to basically put better information behind some of their key business initiatives and help them execute much more effectively. One of the first ones is an institution that had a number of full-service ATMs and wanted to figure out, do we need to offer the full range of services at every ATM? The idea here being fewer moving parts in the software means fewer failures, means higher reliability, means higher availability. And in this case, their focus was trying to look at the usage patterns for each of these services. And what you may find as you look into this is you may find that certain services are very heavily used at certain ATMs and very rarely used at others. You may actually want to consider removing a service, directing your customers to a close nearby location to execute that service, and therefore you're actually reducing the complexity of that ATM. Similarly, you might find that one particular service is very heavily used in a location. It's not available at an adjacent ATM, and it would make a lot of sense to make it available there because you might acquire more customers and acquire higher transaction volumes that would help you make that ATM more profitable. Second example here is a customer in the Middle East who is pretty innovative in terms of their marketing at the ATM. So they look at the ATM as a point to both acquire new customers as well as to deepen their relationship with existing customers. So they run a lot of marketing campaigns. Their challenge was the feedback loop on the success of those campaigns was way too long for them to act effectively. would take weeks to get back data on how a campaign was running. They wanted to do this in much more of a web-style way where you A/B test a campaign, see what works very quickly, and switch over to the one that seems to be working best. So they wanted to shrink that feedback loop, and real-time transaction monitoring gave them that ability. Third case here, it's a number of banks that want to try to optimize their fleet. And one of the big challenges of optimizing a fleet is handling your peak loads and making sure that you've got enough capacity there, that you're not disappointing customers or ending up with very long queues during peak demand. But you also don't want to have a bunch of machines out there that are idle most of the time just so you can handle the peaks. So one of the things a number of customers are looking at is, how do we shrink transaction times during peak periods so that we can move more customers through a single machine? If we're able to get our transaction time down from 45 seconds to 30 seconds, well, we can move a lot more customers through that particular ATM and potentially avoid having to place a second one in that location, or even be able to remove one from a location and redeploy it elsewhere. So again, using transaction monitoring information to be able to better guide your ATM placement around a peak load scenario. So those are three examples of where being able to harness this data can give you a much better visibility into what's happening in the environment and help you make much better decisions. Some of the key initiatives we've seen customers align their transaction monitoring investment with are listed on this slide. This is kind of the top 10 key initiatives where transaction monitoring can help. I won't take you through all of these examples. You will see them in the white paper. But just as I'll pick one out at random here, reducing wait times by improving screen flow. So this gets to that last case I talked about, where you may want to test out 4 or 5 different screen flows to see what impact those screen flows have on the customer's transaction time. And once you've got one that works best, you're going to switch all of your ATMs over to that same screen flow. But you can afford to experiment because you have all the data that you need and the ability to measure which of your experiments was the most successful. One of the other ones that is, when you think about it, is a very obvious way to generate a return on investment in transaction monitoring is many of the banks I speak with pay on a monthly basis to get back their own data about what their customers are doing at the ATM. If you're able to eliminate that cost, you've instantly found a budget line to fund investing in transaction monitoring. And by the way, by owning the data yourself, you're going to have more control over it and much more granular detail than you could ever get from a third party. You may also find you have a very powerful competitive advantage because that third party is providing that same uniform data feed to everyone they do business with. Whereas if you're collecting your own information in much richer detail off of your network, you actually have a lot more information than your competitors. So if you're in an outsourcing relationship, this could be a real key gain for you. Okay, so just to start to wrap up here, there really are 3 ways to achieve return on investment from transaction monitoring. The first one is really around reducing your operational costs. So by isolating and resolving issues faster, knowing what transactions are happening or not happening, you can reduce the actual cost of running the ATM environment from a human investment standpoint, if you will. Second is that you can find gains by improving your channel profitability. If you reduce your failed interactions by 26% or even by 10%, you're going to open up a huge amount of profitability in the ATM channel. You're going to improve your availability, and you're going to be able to make better decisions about where to place ATMs and what services to offer. And finally, we are all ultimately in this to deliver an amazing experience to the customer. And so part of that is achieving the availability number, but part of it is achieving availability at a more granular level, ensuring that your customer is satisfied with every single transaction they execute at your ATM, understanding what they're doing, what services they're using, and how you can improve and optimize it for them. So with that, we will shift to a Q&A. Before we do that, 2 things. Number one, if anyone would like a demonstration of INETCO Insight to see what this looks like, we are always happy to do that. Or if you'd like some help building out a business impact model along the lines of what you'll see in the white paper, then we're also very much happy to help you with that. Okay, so Brad, with that, let's open up for questions.
Sounds good. I've got a few here, and again, please feel free to add more and send them through the chat function. I think you actually quickly touched on this one right at the end, but somebody did ask, can INETCO help me build a customized impact model?
Yes, so everything behind this is an Excel calculator, so we can work with you to plug in your own values. I'd actually be very curious to see what your assumptions are in different places and how your financial metrics work, and we'd be very much happy to work through that model with you. So if anyone wants to do that, let me know. My email address is on the slide here.
And a bit more of a technical type of question, where is the transaction information actually coming from, and how does this solution deploy?
Yeah, this is one of the truly unique advantages of INETCO Insight. We're capturing the transaction information off of the network. So we're actually monitoring the network passively between the ATM and the transaction switch. We're doing that in a very secure fashion and in a way that's PCI compliant. But the nice part about that approach is there's no agents on the ATM, there's no agents on your transaction switch, there's no changes to your transaction switch, there's no overhead or load. And it's also a model that scales very well, both across channels. So if you want to do this for your mobile channel, scales across that as well. Or as your ATM channel continues to get more complicated and there's more and more services that an ATM is calling into, acquiring that data off the network turns out to be a much more effective way of getting a complete picture than trying to monitor it off the transaction switch or off of logs on the ATM, which is the classic way of doing it.
And we have a question here regarding some of the stats that were used in the webinar. Just basically, what are the references for some of these stats? So regarding the faster problem discovery, troubleshooting, performance awareness, like the 2 of 5 problems reported in the 57% of data volumes growing faster than organizations can process.
Someone caught my negligence on footnotes, and I apologize for that. I'm usually much more careful with those. But there are footnotes for all of those details in the white paper. The source of all that information is a report by an industry analyst firm called Track Research. It's called the Application Performance Monitoring Spectrum Report. They completed that about a year ago, and it was based on a survey of, I think, about 400 IT executives involved in application performance projects.
Okay, what else here? And how would you determine the value of an ATM using transaction analytics?
Yeah, this is an interesting one because take an ATM that, let's say you expect your ATMs to do 6,000 transactions a month, like our example, and you find you've got one that's only doing 3,000 transactions. Well, so your default would be, well, that ATM is half as valuable as my typical ATM. But if you start to look at the transaction flow from that ATM, you might start to notice interesting things that change your mind about the value of that ATM. You might notice, for instance, that many customers execute very complex transactions at that ATM, ones that otherwise would cost you a lot in the branch. So the value of that goes up. Second, you might notice that ATM services a large number of your platinum customers who make large cash withdrawals. So again, the value of that ATM goes up. And so by looking at the actual transactions that are flowing from an ATM and the services that customers are using and who's using them, you get a much better picture of the value of every ATM in your fleet. And you might be surprised as you start to look at ones that you think are high volume successful ATMs may not be as valuable to you as others that are they're kind of hidden gems in the environment.
And the question regarding the groups that typically use this type of transaction management or monitoring solution.
Yeah, so there's a number of groups in the organization. I would say that the real center of gravity is around the ATM operations and the channel management teams. Those are the folks that are using a product like INETCO Insight day in and day out. We often see it extended to the general IT operations team so that they can collaborate more effectively with the ATM team. Reports from the system will often go into senior management, and we have customers where the INETCO Insight screen sits right outside the executive management offices as well.
Another question here. How do you interact with multi-vendor software solutions when some already include a sophisticated monitoring system?
Yeah, so we see most of our customers are multi-vendor, running multi-vendor software on their ATMs and multiple hardware devices as well. One of the nice parts about capturing this information off the network like INETCO Insight does is it doesn't really matter to us what software is running on the ATM or what hardware is running, what transaction switch is running. We're going to normalize that transaction data and be able to capture it universally. The second part of it is, yes, there are a number of different monitoring systems out there typically available from the major ATM manufacturers. The ApterVision is probably one of the better examples in the market. Those are primarily focused around incident management, device monitoring, inventory management, again, really concerned, and cash management, I should add, really concerned with what's happening with the ATM itself. What INETCO Insight is doing is giving you visibility into what the customer is doing at that ATM by looking at the transaction flow.
It looks like more questions regarding the analytics side of things. How flexible is the KPI-related reporting system, and can I customize alerts and analytics reported?
Yes, all of that is customizable. You can create just about any alert that you want for any kind of condition. We have customers who have several dozen alerts that are set up to run on a routine basis. And any of the KPIs and analytics can all be tailored as well. So you can count and add up transactions by any possible way you want. We have a number of customers that run multiple currencies out of their ATMs. They look at different transactions by currency type, ones that run all sorts of unusual card products, and they want to analyze by different card products as well. So yeah, all that flexibility is available.
A question about expanding, I guess, beyond the ATM. Can we correlate transaction information from multiple sources? So somebody that's using a mobile banking app and then kind of transacting via the ATM as well.
Yes. So essentially, as long as it's a transaction that flows across the network, INETCO Insight can see it. Because we're analyzing the transaction at a very deep level, we can pick up on information that can help us correlate activity across channels. So yeah, INETCO Insight, we've spoken mostly about ATM scenarios today, but it is truly an omni-channel monitoring solution.
And then someone asked, beyond the transaction, does Insight provide access to dashboards for real-time status monitoring?
Yeah, this is a good question. We can certainly, because we're sitting at the network level, we can see all the status messages going back and forth. So we can make some pretty good assumptions about what's happening in events at the ATM. But I would say that the software systems available from major vendors like NCR really excel at doing that status and condition monitoring. We see the data, but I don't think we have anywhere near the powerful visualizations and event management and incident management that a tool like that would have.
And somebody asking, how do you typically get started, and what's the pricing behind a solution like this?
So getting started is really just, obviously a question of trying to understand what you want to achieve and what use cases you're most interested in with INETCO Insight. The software can be set up for a trial very easily and quickly in your environment because we only need the access to the network data. So we're typically up and running within a few weeks. Often what takes the longest is for customers to provision a server to run our software on. Price, it's perfectly priced for the value that it provides is one way to answer that question. We have a number of different pricing models for Insight though, and that's probably best handled in a one-on-one discussion either with an INETCO sales rep or your NCR account manager if you work closely with NCR.
A question around the PCI compliance. So as you're capturing PCI compliant data, where is this being stored? Do you offer PCI attestation letter to customers?
Yes, so you're right that there is data flowing across the network that is sensitive and subject to PCI. The simple answer is we do not store it. We don't store it, we don't display it, we don't transmit it. So we actually have a security model in the product that knows how to find that sensitive information, how to truncate it or actually eliminate it in memory before it ever hits disk. So we're very careful about how we handle that. all of our customers go through PCI audits and have gone through multiple audits with Insight in place.
Somewhat related to that, what about end-to-end encryption?
Yeah, so if you're using end-to-end encryption in your environment, so from the ATM all the way through to the switch, we can certainly monitor that traffic. There's two ways to do it. One is that we capture the traffic off of the switch where it's in the clear. The second is that we actually host security keys on the Insight server that allow us to decrypt that traffic. Again, there's no magic to this. If you want to see inside encrypted traffic, you have to decrypt it to understand it. So we have a number of mechanisms for doing that.
All right. It looks like questions are starting to slow down. One last one here. Are you able to tell reasons of Visa transaction fallback rate?
Yes. So this is, I'm going to assume for this one that this is an EMV transaction, which obviously we're seeing in more and more parts of the world, where if something doesn't quite go right with an EMV transaction, it'll fall back to a swipe or a manual, typically not a manual entry, but a swipe transaction, which costs the bank more and actually has a different fraud profile as well. So yes, we have a number of customers who, as part of their EMV compliance initiatives, have used INETCO Insight to really understand at a detailed level why they're having fallbacks and what their fallback rates are. So for anyone who's looking at an EMV project, that's another great business case for bringing a product like INETCO Insight into play.
I think we're getting close to the wrap-up time, but I'm going to fit one more question in here. How can an organization leverage the use of Insight to be proactive in the execution of daily operations for ATM status?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. So there's a couple of areas where I've seen customers really shift their operations to much more of a proactive standpoint. One of the obvious ones is looking at response times. Often a change in response time, so a sudden change from 20 seconds to 30 seconds, for instance, is a pretty powerful indicator that something is happening in the environment, especially if transaction rates are staying the same and response times are going way up. That's a case where we have customers who will set alerts for when their response times are starting to get unacceptable, and they will actually then investigate, look at all the transactions that were captured by that alert, and investigate to see if there's something going on. So they're able to be much more proactive in that standpoint. The other way is looking at potentially there are certain services that are not quite as reliable or that you see customers struggling with, or you may all of a sudden notice that there's a number of abandoned transactions at a particular location after a software upgrade. All of those things are cases where you can be proactive and really start to notice anomalies and unusual behavior. I guess the last one I'll give is we had one customer where we noticed that the ATM servicing was not at all adhering to the ATM servicing schedule. The machine was opened up and changed at a completely different time than they thought it would be. So all those sorts of things you can begin to notice, those anomalies in how your environment is behaving.
All right, thanks a lot, Mark, and to everyone that has been able to join us. Again, we'll be sending this out, or this recording of the webinar out, and should you have any questions that you think of in regards to the information you've seen, please don't hesitate to send them through to Mark, whose email is on the slide, or myself, and my email is on your meeting invite. So thanks again, and wishing you all a great rest of your day.